For this week's tutorial, we're going to be looking at the Roaring Twenties, and I want to not try cover too much, too thinly, and so I want to cover the Roaring Twenties from the perspective of three nations, and three nations that will significantly impact world history for the next at least 3 decades, really closer for two of them, for the United States and the Soviet Union, for the rest of the 20th century. And so I want to look at the 1920s from the perspective of the United States, from Germany, and from the Soviet Union. Firstly, the United States. The United States in the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties brought the United States not only into the 20th century, but it became a leader in the world in cultural endeavors, particularly in technological changes. One of the main reasons for this is that during the 1920s, during World War One, the United States getting involved in World War One, as we saw, but it's only in late 1917. Most of the troops don't end up in Europe till 1918, and obviously the United States never actually gets attacked. And so, while France and Britain, in particular, and Germany, trying to rebuild after World War One, the United States don't have that pressure on them, and so it goes into the 1920s with this sense of optimism. It's been part of a winning war, and now it's going to increasingly change the way people interact. Particularly, social changes become really significant. One of the reasons for the changes in society is that, as I said during when we talked about the legacy of World War One, the war was so horrific and so confronting that it shook the foundations of the old world. And so the world of gentry, the world of lords and ladies, of old social institutions, they were all exposed as being completely inadequate in dealing with this new modern world that we live in. And because of that, society wanted to break free of those things. They wanted to break free of those old ideas and create something new. Nowhere is this seen more prevalent than in the case of women. How life changed for women very considerably during the 1920s. Now, for us, the changes seem restrictive, but in the 1920s, these changes were absolutely radical. One thing that gives rise is the rise of the flapper. Yeah. The flapper was the term used for a young girl who was more daring in her speech, the way she talked. She was more daring in her behaviour and in her dress sense. Novels and films really advocated for this. The Great Gatsby, for example, is an important example. And this new woman was very different from the old Victorian era expectations for women. And so, women would now wear makeup, they would wear shockingly short skirts, and they would smoke, which seems pretty straightforward to us, but smoking for a woman in public was seen as something really liberating for them. Probably not for their lungs, but oh well. Together with this sense of women were now to be seen in public, not just there, but now we're seen, where we're happy to be the centre of attention. Together with that was this new political movement, which now demanded the right to vote. And so this was prompted partly, not just in the US, but throughout the world, partly prompted by the fact that during the World War, a lot of women had to go into the industrial workforce to help out because the men were out at war. And so they get out of that because the men come back and sometimes take their jobs. But the women get out of that going, we want political rights. And and so they push, and throughout the 1920s, there's a push worldwide for women to get the vote. Together with this, women would also start to move out of homes earlier, so move away from their parents' influence. And as you can imagine, when that is involved, there's a significant change in the way society approach sex in particular. And so uh, a survey done in the US in the 1920s found that 14% of women born before 1900 engaged in premarital sex by the age of 15, but as many as 39% of women born in the 1910s or 20s had engaged in premarital sex. And so one of the key driving forces behind this is Margaret Sanger and the birth control movement. So we looked at her when we did eugenics and the eugenics movement, and kind of the social side of what uh, Margaret Sanger's trying to do is she's opening up this idea that sex can just be for fun. It doesn't have to result in a baby. And so, even though the sexual revolution will really happen in the 1960s, it doesn't. The sexual revolution doesn't appear out of nowhere. Birth control and ideas around sex had significantly changed from the 1920s onwards. Uh, as you can imagine, also divorce rates start to increase, and so by the mid 1920s, 1 in 7 marriages end in divorce. See that will increase to almost half today. Um, the workforce also changes in the US. So the US in the 1920s was definitely an era of prosperity. Um, Americans had never lived so well, and even though the origins of this start before the 1920s, the 1920s kind of see the flourishing of this. Um, the working week fell from pretty much 56 hours a week to down to around 44 hours. But at the same time, your wage rose 25%. So um, Americans in the 1920s now actually got leisure time. It wasn't just about work, work, home, church. It's now, hey, we've got leisure time and we've got disposable income. So it sounds obvious, but when you've got less time at work and more disposable income, it leads a society to be driven for the pursuit of pleasure. And so that is what really the 1920s is about. You've got dance halls starting to open up, movie theatres, fun parks, sports like baseball and that really become popular during this time. By 1929, American families had spent over 20% of their household earnings on such items as phonographs, factory-made furniture, radios, electric appliances, automobiles, and just entertainment. What what people couldn't afford, though, they would borrow on credit. And so by the end of the 1920s in America, 3/4 of all furniture, phonographs, washing machines, all of that, all the big appliances people are getting, all the latest stuff, 3/4 of that is being bought on credit. So by the time the Wall Street market will crash, you got a lot of people who automatically go into crippling debt. But in the mid 1920s, when this is at its height, people aren't thinking about that because this is new and we don't know the consequences of this. And so this is pleasure and greed kind of put into hyperspeed. Um, another thing that characterizes the 1920s in America is technological changes. So you got changes like the vacuum cleaner comes in, but that's not super entertaining to talk about. One of the most obvious and popular ones is the car. Henry Ford is at the forefront of this. So he invents a moving assembly line, and so it can produce a car 4 times faster than what's been previously produced. That means it's been produced faster and cheaper, therefore it's cheaper for people to buy. He gives his employees a 5-day working week and gives them enough money to actually buy a car. And so now cars become more popular, they've become more seen in society, and all of a sudden, the tyranny of distance, as sometimes used about Australia, that the idea that our distance now doesn't becomes less of an issue. And so to go with your more money and more time, now you can go to more places. And together with that is the continued inventions with planes. So obviously planes play a role in World War One, and wars are really important for technological advances because they kind of drive people to um, really try to get an advantage over the enemy. But in peacetime, you use those technological advances to really help society, or promote them in society. And so planes become increasingly popular. They're not super popular commercially, but they become safer, and um, they become almost like a nationalistic. If we can achieve something with technology or with planes, then look how good we are. And so Australia does that. Uh, so Charles Kingsford Smith, he flies from America to Australia in 1928. It's kind of seen as a hero, and eventually gets Sydney Airport named after him. And so you've got this new technologies which is opening up the world to people that they would never have experienced before. Closer to home, the film industry really starts to blossom. And films, by the mid 1920s in America, they're selling 50 million tickets each week. And so going to the theatre becomes really part of your night out. Um, and like some of them would talk, it's meant to be each week, not each week. Um, some people would talk about how not only do movies open up, a new night out option, but it opens up new ideas to people. And as is still prevalent today, a lot of people would learn about new ideas from films. And so uh, a young woman in the 1920s during an interview said, "The only benefit I ever got from the movies was in learning to love and the knowledge of sex." And so this idea that they're, they're learning things from these films. And so, which sounds obvious, but think about, they're not learning them from going to traditional institutions like the church. They're not learning them from, the schooling. They're learning them from these entertainment theatres. The radio becomes another great way to bring people together. So, listening to the radio, getting your family around and listening to the radio. Um, but it also promotes advertising. And so now you can advertise your products on the radio. So Wheaties, like Wheat Bix, the American version, that's the first ever ad on radio. Sports games now get promoted, are now on radio, and so now you get sports stars, just like you got movie stars. Now sports stars start to happen. Um, and by 1926, 5 million homes have a radio. And so, what in 1920, there was only 2,000 families in America that had a radio. 6 years later, you've got 5 million. Um, Now, some other changes. One was prohibition in society. So, prohibition, uh, led by groups such as the Anti-Saloon League, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They brought in prohibition on the 17th of January 1920 to combat what was perceived to be a really heavy drinking culture in the US. And so they argued that alcohol bans would reduce societal problems like domestic violence and things like that. But as I've said before, for every action, there's a reaction. And so if you're going to prohibit alcohol during a time where people are looking for new experiences, you're going to have a counter reaction to that. And this was in the form of underground drinking clubs and parties. Some farmers would sell bricks of grapes, and you just add water to them and put them in the cupboard for 3 weeks, and then that would actually turn into wine. And so you got new ways of essentially getting around these laws. And so for for as much as prohibition was doing, it's actually also not promoting, but also generating crime. And people like Al Capone, he becomes a real celebrity criminal during this time, and there's a distinct increase in gang warfare. And so people saw it as, a lot of Americans, particularly young Americans, saw it as almost a liberating thing to go to these underground parties and be involved in essentially criminal activity, because you're going up against the system, the institutions that have brought this in. And the 1920s were all about going up against traditional institutions and ideas. That kind of summarized it. Um, for all the positive things that happen, whenever societies do go through significant changes and transitions, groups that are usually on the extremity of societies, they often gain popularity. And so the 1920s saw the re-emergence of the KKK. And so the Ku Klux Klan, during World War One, they kind of re-emerged, but the 1920s, they become really popular. Um, by 1925, it has at least 5 million members. And they're just formal members. There are a lot of people who supported what the KKK stood for, but didn't formally join for a variety of reasons. But um, particularly popular, obviously, mostly in the southern states, Georgia, Alabama, and that. Uh, they do pressure, because they have such a significant influence, they pressure legislation. So the 1924 Immigration Act that prevented immigration of people from Eastern Europe, that we saw with the eugenics lecture, that was driven by the pressure from the KKK. Um, one sympathetic observer explained that the Ku Klux Klan, or the Ku Klux movement, seemed to be another expression of the general unrest and dissatisfaction with both local and national conditions, the high cost of living, social injustice and equality, poor administration of justice, political corruption, hyphenism, disunity, uh, unassimilated, and conflicting thought and standards. They are distressing all thoughtful men. So, in other words, during this great time of change, the KKK stood for something that remained the same, stood for what they would argue traditional white American values. And so, if you've got all of a sudden you've got an immigrant that's coming in who's taken your job, or taken part of, works at your factory, also gets more than you. You've now got less money. You've got an organization you can go to. If you're angry at the world for anything, the KKK can stand up for you, as long as you're white, obviously. And so it obviously supports segregation laws in the South, particularly. But then from the 20s to the 60s, the KKK is kind of at their prime, and at their most influential. And so it's significant that for all this time of change, and we can focus on all the things that do change, there are many in society who are really disturbed by the amount of changes. And when people get like that, they tend to um, gravitate. Well, history has shown that a lot of people gravitate towards the extremities because they view the KKK, for all their weird dressing up and grandmasters and grand dragons and all that sort of stuff that they talk about. For all of that, they do, in some people, stand for the traditional white American um, nation that they loved. And so, same thing happens in Australia. We don't have a KKK version, but we have segregation and all that in Australia. So um, the 1920s, and that is the very much the height of that as well. So that's America. Now let's see what's happening in Germany in the 1920s. Now you have to go back to the end of World War One to understand what's happening in Germany. November of 1918, Germany is in a state of collapse and revolution. So as we saw with the World War One lecture, um, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, he abdicates the throne because he's lost control of the army. And so after that, they have elections in December of 1918 for a national assembly, and they're going to create a new parliamentary constitution. They create that in Weimar, the town of Weimar, and hence why this new government is called the Weimar Republic, and it's got the Weimar Constitution, and it's led by the Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert. The first thing that they face almost immediately is that there's a communist revolution called the Spartacus, and so they're led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and they want to overthrow Ebert's government and set up their own council of workers. So they want their own version of the Russian Revolution. They want that in Germany, and obviously the Bolsheviks actually supported them in this and actually wanting to get this happening. They begin their uprising. It's going well, but then the government, so the Weimar Republic, get the Free Corps, who are ex-soldiers back from the war. They get them to fight on their side. There's a battle, but eventually the Spartacus Revolution is put down, but it's not forgotten. So in that, even though the Communist Party is pretty popular up until the 1930s in Germany, right-wing groups like the Nazis, they will never forget that in the time of crisis, the communists tried to use it for their advantage to take over. And so they'll never forget that. The other problem that the Weimar Republic has is within its own actual constitution. Now, the Australian Constitution you probably never hear much about because, as I remember getting a lecture when I was at uni about the Australian Constitution. The Australian Constitution is so good, it's just so boring. In fact, the Australian Constitution is so good, it's actually used as a template for a lot of other nations. But the German Constitution under the Weimar Republic had two main issues with it. One was Article 48. Article 48 allowed the president to rule by emergency decree and dismiss the Reichstag. So anytime the president wanted to, he could use the chancellor as well, could essentially rule as a dictator. So if the president or the chancellor wanted to get an important law through, but knew that Parliament wouldn't allow it or the Reichstag wouldn't allow it, they could technically bring in or declare Article 48, and so they could actually rule by as dictatorships. Obviously, if you're trying to set up a democracy and you've got a part of your constitution that allows you to rule as a dictator, it's going to undermine people's confidence in this whole thing called democracy. Because in Germany in the 1920s, they're experimenting with democracy. They've never experienced it before, and so they're trying to figure out what is democracy like. And so these are all important, important. What would you call it? Important tests for democracy in Germany if it's going to actually succeed. The second problem that you got with the Weimar Republic constitution is that it's got a proportional representation. So in other words, if your party got 15% of the vote, it got 15% of the members of parliament. And so whatever the number that would be for that year, you got that. What that meant was you had parliament filled with a lot of minority parties, and no one ever, from what I've seen, no one really ever had the majority. You had to form a coalition in order to get things through. And whenever you form a coalition, it can breed discontent, it can breed just a sense of what's the point of working for each other. And so German Parliament would be filled with two members from the equivalent of the Animal Justice Party, three members from the Nazi Party. And so it would just be filled with all these different groups who have no reason politically or constitutionally, no reason and no motivation to actually work together. And so the result of that is that between 1919 and 1933, there are 21 different governments for the Weimar Republic, more than one a year. And so government is constantly changing over, constantly having elections. The last big, not the last, but during this period, the last big battle that the Weimar Republic faces is the Kapp Revolution. So Wolfgang Kapp, he wants to overthrow the monarchy. He wants to overthrow the government and reinstall the monarchy. But that ultimately fails. The government once again used the Free Corps or the returned soldiers to actually defend themselves there. But what it does do is it promotes or it kind of pushes the right wing politics or political parties to the extreme, even more extreme, and so you've got a number of political assassinations between 1919 and 1922. So in that 3 year period, there was 376 political assassinations. So it's pretty much one every 3 days. Someone has been assassinated, and usually by right wing groups. Together with that, the other issue that Germany faced in the early 1920s is inflation. So because they had to pay reparations as part of the Treaty of Versailles, it really distorted the economies not of just of Germany, but also of Europe as well. And so the German government placed no limits on printing banknotes, and soon the printing presses of the banknotes were just operating 24/7. And this is, people often wonder, why don't we just print more banknotes? This is what happens. Banknotes become absolutely redundant. And so you see here the picture of these boys. They're playing blocks, but the blocks they're playing with aren't actually wooden blocks. These are just wads of cash. They would have millions of dollars right here. And what are they doing with them? They're not buying the latest toys because they can't afford them. They're actually just using them for blocks. And so by November of 1923, one American dollar was roughly 44 billion Reichsmarks. And so what would happen is you would go to work and you would get paid twice daily at work. You got paid when you got there, and you would send someone from your family as soon as you got paid to go out and buy you lunch or buy lunch for the family. Then at lunchtime, or after lunch, in the afternoon, you'd get paid, and once again, you would go out and send your someone from your family to go buy dinner and breakfast. The reason you did that is if you waited till the end of the day or the next day to buy food with that money you got from the previous day, the prices would have gone up so far that you couldn't actually afford anything. So when you got paid, you immediately went out and bought something with that. This is a German writer in 1923. I always found this story amusing. So two women were carrying a laundry basket filled to the top with banknotes. Seeing a crowd standing around a shop window, they put the basket down for a moment to see if there was anything they could buy. When they turned around a few moments later, they found the money was untouched, but the basket had been stolen. So you got a basket full of money. The money in there is worthless, or is worth less than the actual basket itself. And so money by the end of 1923 it just meant nothing in Germany. At the same time, in 1923, in January of 1923, Germany cannot make reparations, part of its reparations to France, and so the French send in some troops to occupy the Ruhr region, which is the industrial region where most of the factories are for Germany. And so the French stay there until the Germans pay what they owe them. And it's not just money, like they also, like for example, with this, they have to pay a certain amount of telegraph poles as well, things like that. But the German workers are given permission from their government to passively resist, so that they can go on strike, they can disrupt the French effort as much as they can. And so there's a lot of fighting during this period. The problem is it's a really bad look for the Weimar Republic, this new democracy, that your hated enemy, the French, just occupying a part of your country. And there's footage of the French coming in and beating up Germans on the street, forcing Germans to take off their hats if someone respected went past or things like that. And so it's just a real bad look for the Weimar Republic that they can't even control their own borders, and just show to Germany just how vulnerable they were due to the Treaty of Versailles. However, due to the Dawes Plan, which was initiated in 1924 to 29, they recover from their hyperinflation and they are a booming economy by the end of the 1920s in Germany. They're second only to the US. And so a lot of this revival led to political stability, and so the extreme parties don't really get many votes during this time period. Even by 1928, the Nazi Party are only getting 2% of the vote, so they're a nothing party by this stage. Um, so the German economy has injected $25 billion worth of foreign money. Most of that is coming from the US. So US companies and governments are giving Germany financial aid. Part of this is people were starting to feel like the Treaty of Versailles was actually too harsh on the Germans. Um, Eventually, the French pull out of the Ruhr region in 1925, and so that frees up German industrial resources there. And so by the late 1920s, it looks like democracy is really working in Germany. So Francis Carsten, the years 1925 to 28 were the heyday of the Weimar Republic. Prosperity was restored, and parliamentary institutions seemed to be accepted by the majority of the electorate. Indeed, no observer of the political scene in 1928 could have prophesied that 5 years later Hitler would be in power and parliamentary democracy in ruins. So, despite all of its great recovery, and it was put up as like the poster boy of this is what democracy can do for you. It was essentially one tragedy away from collapse, particularly if that tragedy happened in the US, which is obviously what happens with Wall Street in 1929. But we'll talk about more of that when you look at the Nazis. Last country is the Soviet Union in the 1920s. So we left the Soviet Union in our lecture into the Russian Revolution with the Civil War, and so they've consolidated their power. The Bolsheviks have in Russia, but in 1922, when the Civil War is pretty much over, Lenin's health is failing. He's having a series of strokes. So he has one in May, then another one in December, and so naturally this leads to a discussion about who is going to succeed him, who's going to take over his position of power. In March of 1923, Lenin has another stroke, and he will die in January of 1924. And so immediately after his death, they start to promote this cult of personality around about Lenin. And so the key part to this with Lenin is because he's now seen as this kind of cult figure who truly understood what communism and socialism were about. If you're going to be his successor, you need to make yourself seem as the successor to Lenin's ideas. You need to continue on with what Lenin taught, continue on with what he wanted for the party. Lenin himself didn't want a cult of personality, but they did it despite his protests. Lenin does say this. He writes a testament, a will and testament. He's talking about several people in the party, and one of them is Stalin. And he says of Stalin that Stalin is too rude, a fault intolerable in the office of general secretary. So at this stage, Stalin's role in the party was as general secretary. Therefore, I propose to the comrades to find a way to transfer Stalin from that office and appoint another man more tolerant. So this is a bitter blow to Stalin. So if Stalin wants to take over, he needs to make sure that this testament isn't read out, because then it's going to show everyone that the great Lenin doesn't actually want me to take over. What Stalin does do, though, is he makes sure that this is not read out, but he also undermines Trotsky, his great rival. So Trotsky was seen as the guy with the natural new leader, and one thing that Stalin does is he gives Trotsky some advice and it gives him the wrong date for Lenin's funeral. So Trotsky doesn't show up to the funeral, and Lenin goes, this guy doesn't even show up, and takes advantage of all that, and only because Lenin actually deliberately told Trotsky the wrong date. But these two guys, they're going to vie for power, essentially, throughout the 1920s. And so most of the 1920s in the Soviet Union, there's a lot of other stuff we could talk about, but mainly focus on this power struggle because then that will lead to Stalinism, particularly in the 1930s onwards. So some things that they um, need to, well, some things that they do argue over is how is the party going to be run. So Trotsky thinks that it's too authoritarian. It needs to, involve more people in its decision making. They're going to have a debate about should we continue this global revolution or should we just focus on socialism in our own country. So the great revolutions, communist revolutions throughout Europe, that hasn't happened. It failed in Germany. It fails in Hungary. So what are we doing? Are we going to continue to try push the global revolution, or are we just going to focus on trying to get socialism good and proper and working in our own country, and then focus on um, the other issues? Now, Stalin, he wants socialism in one country, and Trotsky wants a permanent revolution. And then the economy, they're going to debate over the economy about how heavily should we tax the peasants? How should we deal with the kulaks? The kulaks are the rich peasants now, which that seems an oxymoron to us. But how should we deal with them? Do we need their help or should we crush them? Um, so they're going to significantly debate over that. So what Stalin does, it's not just Stalin this whole time, but it will mostly focus on him. He spends the first 3 years from 23 to 25 trying to sideline Trotsky, not completely get rid of him, but just sideline him. And so Stalin actually had, even though he was general secretary, even though that looks like it's just a very behind the scenes kind of job, it actually meant that Stalin had probably the most powerful position in the party. You couldn't join the party and you couldn't be promoted within the party without Stalin's tick of approval. And so, particularly in the 1980s, if you wanted to join a rugby league club like Canterbury Bulldogs or something, you had to have a member sign, kind of vouch for you. And then you get given into the board, and the board would vote about yes or no whether they allow you in. Now, if you were coming in and the member who vouched for you, that board didn't like them, they'd just reject your membership. So they had that kind of power. That's the kind of power Stalin has as general secretary. If you wanted any kind of promotion within the party, you relied on Stalin. And so you had to suck up to Stalin. And so he works with Zinoviev and Kamenev, and he's going to work against Trotsky's power. Trotsky is constantly depicted during this time period as someone who's going against Leninism. So someone who's trying to go against what Lenin wanted for the party. And so that's what these, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin do. They're trying to form this. They form this opposition to Trotsky, and they eventually accuse him of bombardism. So they accuse him of being a charismatic leader who's trying to woo everyone, and he's trying to create factions within the party. Now, one thing that Lenin had explicitly stated is that you can't have, our party won't succeed if it has factions within it. And so Stalin and the others accuse Trotsky of trying to form different factions within the party. Now, ironically, he's formed a faction in order to make that accusation, Stalin has, but don't let that ruin don't let the facts ruin what he's trying to do here. Because he gets accused of factionalism and essentially he gets accused of going against Lenin, Trotsky's supporters start to abandon him. And so by 1925, he really doesn't have that much power. After he sidelines Trotsky, Stalin now needs to destroy those on the left, so those supporters of Trotsky, because by 1925, Kamenev and Zinoviev have actually gone over to Trotsky's side. Why? Because Stalin, over here, he supported socialism in one country, which even though they're communists and that's left wing, within the party that's a more right wing position because it's focusing on the nation. Where these guys over here are focusing on world revolution, which is more left wing. Um, and so these three, Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zidanov, they accuse, or they criticize socialism in one country, and they kind of create this united opposition against Stalin. Stalin, once again, using some new supporters, Bukharin and Rykov, he accuses this united opposition as being trying to spread factionalism again. By November of 1927, Trotsky gets himself expelled. What he does is he organizes a 10-year anniversary of the revolution, but he doesn't get permission to do it. So it looks like he's trying to create an event to win himself support. And so literally because he doesn't get permission for this 10-year anniversary thing, he gets accused of factionalism again, and he's expelled from the party and he's forced into exile into Kazakhstan. So he's removed. And so Zidanov and Kamenev are expelled from the party, but then are allowed back in if they apologize and essentially grovel their way back in, but they're only allowed back in as really low-level positions. And so Stalin, by 1927, has removed the opposition on the left of the party. But he then changes sides to remove his former allies in 28 to 1930. The reason for this is there's a threat that Poland, from China, from the British, that there could be an invasion and a war into the Soviet Union. And so because there's that threat, they need to change how they do the economy. And if they do the economy the way that Stalin had originally been promoting for the last 5 years, they're going to actually fail. And so Stalin swaps sides. He's got two new supporters there with him. And so he's going to target those people on the right of politics, Bukharin and Rykov. And once again, he just calls them factionalists. He's saying these guys are trying to create a faction, they're trying to undermine the party. And eventually he will get them expelled from the party. He starts to implement what's called the first of the 5-year plans. Now, the 5-year plans essentially them forcing socialism on the economy. So with the 5-year plans also goes the idea of collectivization. So collectivization in the Soviet Union is where you get all the private farms or agriculture and you make them into bigger farms that are run by the government or collectives. And they keep enough of the produce to, for the next season, but then the rest of the produce is spread around the country. The 5-year plans are all about industrialization and improving the economy and making the economy and society more modern. And so Stalin will start to implement that during these times. And these are two really extreme left-wing policies. And so that's why he's moved over to the left in the party. By 1928, essentially, 1929, he is the leader of the Soviet Union. He never gets officially, declared dictator, but everyone knows he is the leader. And so he's going to use his power from then. And then you hit the 1930s where things really start to show how horrific a socialist communist country is. The collectivization, they will make a man-made famine in the Ukraine, killing millions there. And so that's outside of this lecture, but you really see the ugly face of socialism in the 1930s. So in conclusion, the 1920s throughout Europe and the US, throughout the world really, just because of its horrific experiences in World War I, the 1920s are really a transitional period. a period of change, great change, and for all the positives that great change brings, it's also a period of um, more extremities, people pushing the boundaries, um, yeah, joining organisations they would never think of. The 1920s were great up until obviously 1929 when you get the Wall Street crash, which is a later lecture. Some good resources if you want to understand this. Ian Kershaw to Hell and Back. It's part of the Penguin series, and they've got a series on the history of Europe, essentially from ancient history right through to today. And Ian Kershaw has one, 1914 to 1949, and it's really good, as the title suggests, about how things really descend in Europe. And the 1920s play a key role in that. Yeah, and there's my email if you've got any questions.